could create conditions that would lead to the rise of a new global welfare state. And by this concept of this welfare state, I guess people are relating that to the social democratic capitalism, which is now, of course, nostalgically remembered as not only a golden age for capitalism, but to some extent, the golden age for Western working class. But if we think about that, we want to ask a question: how come social democratic capitalism was followed by neoliberalism? Well, social democratic capitalism, of course, created conditions that have to resolve the contradictions for the capitalism in the first half of the 20th century, especially about the problem of effective demand. But by setting up institutions that have to sustain relatively high effective demand, such as Keynesianism, such as big government institutions, such as welfare state, it in turn creates conditions that over time tend to increase workers' bargaining power. So workers are less afraid of being unemployed. The workers are less afraid of losing their jobs. The workers have better protection, so they can bargain stronger against capitalists. But remember, we are still in the capitalist system. If workers can bargain stronger, if they demand higher wages, that's bad news for capitalists. And in the capitalist system, if it's bad for capitalists, it's bad for economy. And eventually, it will be bad for workers too. So that after a period of social democratic capitalism, then it's followed by this decline of poverty rate, as we observed from the 1960s to 1980s. Then, to the extent the crisis was not resolved by a socialist revolution, it had to be resolved within capitalism. So it had to be resolved by neoliberalism. So in other words, recreating conditions that would favor capitalist power. So in the current struggle, if our perspective is about to recreate another period of social democracy, then please be careful. Because most likely, if you recreate social democracy, neoliberalism will soon follow. Okay, so I should talk about how was this China's capitalist transition related to the rise of global neoliberalism, right? So by the time of the 1980s, capitalism was suffering from this poverty rate crisis. So to recreate a condition that was favorable for capitalist class, you need to have a set of institutions. You need to have a set of institutions that would again favor the capitalist power. But how do you accomplish that? In addition to creating various institutions within Western capitalist countries that would favor capitalist power, a key set of conditions is that you need to have a new historical context that is decisively favorable for capitalist class, but not favorable for working class. So how do you do that? The best way to do that is to create a new reserve army of cheap labor force. But you can no longer do that within the Western capital countries. So you need to fund this new reserve army of cheap labor force in some other part of the world. So fortunately for the Western capitalist class, you have the counter-revolution in the former socialist states, from China to Eastern Europe to Russia, but especially in China. Because China is so huge, right? And moreover, thanks to the socialist period, because of the social and economic successes in the socialist period. So China could provide, as one we talked about yesterday, China could provide not only a large cheap labor force, but also a high quality, large cheap labor force. So ideal for capitalist accumulation. So that would not only create conditions for foreign capital to make investment in China to make huge profits, but also indirectly undermine the bargaining power of the global working classes. So that we have this simultaneous phenomena of the rise of global neoliberalism and the rise of China. So that is this a graph that shows various indicators related to this economic rise of China. Okay. The lowest line, the blue line, that is just to show the share of China in the world GDP, in the world economic output. By now it's already about 13%, about 13% of world GDP. So measured by purchasing power parity, China is the now second largest economy in the world. But if you follow this trend, China probably will overtake the US to become the world's largest economy by 2015, measured by purchasing power parity. But it's interesting to compare this curve with two other curves. Okay. The red line, that is for China's share in world energy consumption. The dark line, the black line, that is for China's share in world carbon dioxide emissions. Okay. So while China accounts for about less than 15% of world GDP, China now accounts for about 20% of world energy consumption, 25% of world carbon dioxide emissions. So China has overtaken the US already in terms of energy consumption and the carbon dioxide emissions. So we speak of this rise of China that has played a critical role in the rise of global neoliberalism. Right? And to make this somewhat simplified, and we already know that the neoliberal global economy now is in serious trouble, right? And while China's cheap labor force contributed to the rise of global profit rate, it also created a new contradiction. In particular, when you have rising global inequalities, again we have a question about how to sustain high effective demand for the expansion of global capitalist economy. And from the 1990s to 2000s, we know that to a large extent, it depends on the debt finance consumption in the US, which was not sustainable. And then so that we have got the crisis from 2008 to 2009. And we are still suffering from the crisis, and it's quite likely that Europe or US could enter into another major crisis in the near future. So